This episode contains discussions of sensitive topics, including domestic violence and child sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised. When she looks back, Rachel can see that Mike's actions often revealed a lack of empathy. But it was one specific day that really brought things into sharp focus for her. Standing out on their deck, Mike spotted a coyote way off in the distance, and he decided to pull out his gun. Maybe he was bored or angry, or he just wanted to feel powerful. Or maybe he wanted to teach his young sons a lesson. They were starting to cry because they didn't want him to kill it. And maybe Mike couldn't tolerate that. Men are supposed to be strong and in control, after all. He told Rachel he couldn't even see the coyote over the sights of his gun. That's how far away it was. But he squeezed the trigger anyway. He was a cop, he knew how to use a gun, and he could tell he'd hit it. Only problem is it was still alive, and he didn't know where it had gone. His sons were crying, even screaming now. They couldn't believe he'd done that. So he decided to send them out there, a couple terrified young kids wandering around in search of a wounded coyote. That'd teach them. It was a watershed moment for Rachel. There'd been signs before, but red flags are hard to spot when past traumas cloud your vision. Now it was impossible to ignore. This was a dangerous man, and she needed to get herself and her kids away from him. I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories, and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist's chair. This week, we're continuing our look at the ways that family court and reunification therapy often fail to protect those who need protecting most. My guest is Rachel Pickrel Hawkins, whose story gained national attention after she was sentenced to jail for trying to keep her kids away from their abusive father. Rachel grew up in the Denver area. When she was 21, she started working as a dispatcher for a local police and fire rescue. Her father and brother-in-law worked at the same police department, and it was also where she ended up meeting Mike, who would later become her husband, meaning she saw up close and personal the loyalty, self-protectionism, and up-against-the-world mentality that often marks these environments. Rachel's father had strongly warned her about getting involved in relationships with law enforcement officers. But sometimes that can be hard to avoid when so much of your life revolves around one place. Mike was about 7 years older than her, and her first impression of him was that he was funny and charming, if not a little macho and immature. And she really didn't think much beyond that at first, since he was married at the time. But it was a small department, so inevitably they started getting to know each other as friends. And her first impressions held true. He was funny and charming. But he also had a brash and volatile side that was well known.
Throughout the course of his career, it was riddled with complaints. He's been disciplined, and that is no secret that he has a disciplinary history throughout his employment. The other thing, too, is about the first responder and the law enforcement world is that it is a thicker than blood type of organization. That brotherhood is solid. When you are in that field, your natural defense when you hear things about your colleagues and coworkers is, that's not true. Just another attack, just another criminal saying this, just another lowlife saying this, just another unhappy citizen saying this. That is the attitude and the mentality often amongst the employees. I understand that because they do also get a lot of that. they do also get a lot of baseless complaints. And I've seen that, so I understand that. But when you hear of things, it's very easy to have that bias. So when I would hear of his complaints, I didn't know all the information. My natural tendency was to go along with everybody else's bias of, oh, that's just a citizen overreaction or whatever. Then you've got the whole thing of the field does attract those that can have personalities for disorders and power and control and abuse. And that's no secret either that the rate of domestic violence is highest amongst the career field of law enforcement. And that's what we know of. That's what is reported, right? Because we also know, according to statistics, that a good majority of domestic violence goes unreported.
Rachel had been in an abusive relationship in the past, and she says her view of what was quote-unquote normal was skewed by past experience. It can be next to impossible to recognize red flags when you don't even realize that you're caught in a cycle of trauma and abuse. Not to mention, in that environment, behind the thin blue line, a man acting entitled and aggressive can sometimes just seem like par for the course. So after he'd been divorced for a couple of years and they eventually started dating, the bar wasn't all that high in terms of how she expected to be treated by a man. She tried not to dwell on his apparent darker side, which would eventually be revealed in all of its horror.
The whole thing that attracted me to him was his charmingness for being a steady Eddie and being funny and easygoing. He would do things for you. His love language is acts of service. If I had to describe him, he does things for people. Now, what comes with that when you're in a relationship is often different. And so that's what people don't see, right? He's doing all these things for everybody else. He's very charming. He's very this, he's very that. However, behind closed doors, the psychological terrorist holding you hostage inside your home, making you feel crazy, making you feel you're not good enough, making you feel that you're nothing without him, you'll go nowhere without him, being fearful of the connections that he's made throughout his career. People don't understand that. They don't understand how when my children describe him in the manner that they did in the forensic interviews and doing the things that he has done to them that are abusive and have been established, people find that hard to believe because they know this whole other side, right?
Rachel and Mike had been friends for a while, and it wasn't long at all after they started dating that they decided to get married. But then, just a few weeks before the wedding, they had a really big falling out. Rachel even threw her ring at him at one point and decided to break up. Looking back, Rachel says that moment feels like God handed her a get-out-of-jail-free card. And this was her chance to run for the hills. But again, she could not recognize that at the time. She did decide to seek counseling while they were separated, though. And she says that it helped her start finding a lot of healing in other areas of her life. And that foundation, the things Rachel learned about herself in therapy, would be a lifeline for her during the next 18 years of their marriage. Because she and Mike did end up getting back together after a few months, and they decided to get married right away. During that first year of marriage, Rachel was working on an eBay business. She says she's always been something of an entrepreneur. Through that work, she made contact with a man in Australia, and she remembers being struck by how kind he was to her. When the opposite has become your norm, basic human decency can feel pretty foreign. That was the first inkling of doubt about her marriage. But she took her vows seriously. She had been divorced before, and she didn't want another divorce. And she certainly did not want to be a single mom again. She had 2 daughters coming into this relationship, and she could see Mike showering them with attention and affection, really just loving on them. And that had to be a good thing, right? It's only now that she knows what to call it.
They call it grooming is the term. And interestingly enough, I didn't recognize it in my own relationship with him and with he and my daughters looking back. But those behaviors were there. He was always willing to be with the girls. He was always willing to let me go and do this and give me time away and be with the girls. And there are things that are in the criminal matters. And looking back, those incidents should have been red flags to me first if I had known that they were going on. And I didn't know that they were going on, but now looking back, it's like, wow, okay, I see where that was. And I saw that behavior throughout my relationship and being with him. Obviously, this has been in the media and it's also within the criminal case, the incident of him nearly drowning my son. I think that was when I made the biggest mistake of not leaving. That is when I should.
That's fast forwarding a bit, and it's only a shadow of what Rachel would discover. She would eventually be the mother of 6 kids, including the 2 daughters from before Mike, plus a daughter and 3 sons with him. Even if she had the clarity she has now, even if she could have seen all of the insidious patterns and red flags around her, Rachel wouldn't have known how to leave and go out on her own with all of those young kids. Not that she didn't try in whatever ways she could.
We had this cycle within our marriage. We married and separated over and over again. And domestic violence victims can take 7 to 10 times attempts to try to leave. And our cycle was to separate. Then when we get back together, we would move to a new home. And we would start the cycle again. Things would fall apart. We would separate, get back together, and move to a new home. We moved in May of 2021, and we were supposed to be starting our dream. And in early January of 22, things between us had become so contentious and just so strained. And one day he shot a coyote with the kids around for no reason. It was very, very far away. It was so far away, his entire sight of his gun, he told me, covered the animal, that he didn't see where he actually shot the animal. So he ended up wounding it, and it took off. And he sent my sons defenseless out to help them look for an injured coyote after they had just been screaming and crying because they didn't like that he did that. And that's when I finally was, okay, it's over. And I told him right away, I'm done. I can't be married to you anymore. It doesn't matter that we told the kids we would stay together. This is it. It's over. We need to divorce. And he agreed. And it started off as a very, very amiable divorce. But the longer that we stayed separated and the kids saw me getting stronger and that I wasn't going back, then they started talking. Then things started coming out that I didn't know had happened during their childhood, and I was blown away. And a lot of that has had to be covered in my own therapy because I just was not understanding, where was I? How did this happen when I was there? I was there. How did this happen? And having to understand that as a mom in a family of children who are being abused, and you are also in that cycle with them. And then it was about 10 months finally of staying separated because my history was going back within 3 to 6. At the 10-month marker is when one of my daughters finally came forward and shared what she had endured since she was a little girl.
Some of the horrors Rachel learned about are public record now, like the criminal charges that Mike had raped his elementary-aged daughter. And remember what Rachel said a minute ago about him nearly drowning their son? The son told her that was retribution because he had caught Mike sticking his hand down his daughter's underwear. I'm not sharing these details for shock value. It's important to know exactly what kind of man we're talking about here, because it makes everything that comes next and all of the ways the court failed Rachel and her family even more disturbing. She had heard more than enough to pursue charges and do everything she could to protect her children from Mike. It wasn't easy at all. Rachel was a survivor right alongside her kids. meaning she had her own wounds and blind spots to work through while she fought for them. Not to mention learning how to navigate a system that in many ways favored Mike. But the longer she stayed away from him, the stronger she got. And Mike could see this. He became increasingly desperate to get her back under his control. So things only became more intense as the investigation picked up, as the police reports and forensic interviews started to make it all feel very, very real. Rachel says those early days of the proceedings, when she learned about all of the traumas that her kids had endured, it was just the beginning of her world blowing up, an explosion that hasn't stopped.
The biggest thing that I have difficulty getting over, it's one thing as an adult to take somebody's abuses, but when they happen to your own children, there's nothing you can do to undo it. That's the place where I struggle with the most. I want them to be okay. I want justice for them. I want healing for them. And along this road, there have been so many people that have hurt them, that are supposed to be trusted, that are supposed to be educated, certified, stamped with the stamp of approval.
After the initial forensic interviews, Rachel was able to secure a temporary protection order. That meant Mike finally had to move away from them. He'd been living in a mother-in-law unit attached to their house during this entire separation. The protection order was a reprieve, and it gave Rachel and the kids a little room to breathe. But Mike had no intention of going down without a fight.
It wasn't too long after that he filed for divorce using a criminal defense attorney who's a former DA, and just immediately started the narrative, the wash, rinse, repeat cycle that they use with abusive fathers, the whole narrative of the parental alienation syndrome, litigation stuff. Mom's crazy, mom's keeping the kids, mom's brainwashing, let's do reunification therapy. It just started immediately.
We should remember the context in which Rachel and Mike met. He was very much a part of the good old boy network, with all of the entitlement that comes with that. Not to mention all of the connections in law enforcement and legal circles. He flat out denied the allegations against him, the stories his own kids were telling about him. And he refused to participate with CPS, detective interviews, and anything that might help to indict him. By now, most of the kids were old enough to be on their own and make their own decisions. But Mike planned to fight for custody of their youngest two sons. Once the divorce was issued, Rachel's neighbors and friends started seeing Mike drive by the house. Mike knew exactly how to maintain a sense of terror and fear in that home, in ways that wouldn't immediately be obvious to outsiders. When the judge lifted the protective order against Mike, Mike was given full access to the house, including the right to sell it whenever and however he wanted, even though Rachel and the kids were still living there.
Judge Daniel McDonald found me to be lacking credibility and highly manipulative, is what he said. And there were no formal criminal charges. And that is what he based his entire divorce decree decisions, plural, not just parenting time or my jailing, but everything in that divorce to include finances, dropping my child support, ordering me to keep the kids on Medicaid, staying indigent, and giving him total control of the home and removing the protection order. Judge Daniel McDonald lined everything up so that they could perfectly execute getting me and the children out of the home, being homeless, getting in there and selling it. And that's exactly what happened. He drove by within hours. He was contacting within hours. The realtor then contacted me immediately.
And so Rachel and her kids ended up in a shelter, and she couldn't afford an attorney either. And she remembers walking into court one day and hearing the judge and her ex's attorney talking about their golf games, like they were old buddies. It started to feel more and more like the deck was stacked against her. So it's not really a surprise that the judge would rule in favor of reunification therapy, even though the DA was still investigating Mike for criminal charges.
Because there were no formal charges from the DA yet. Because the DA had been still investigating for over a year. I don't know, Leah. I am not a trained professional. I am not an attorney. I am not a rocket scientist. But I certainly wonder if a DA is taking over a year to investigate something and not dropping the charges. I might think that I would wait and find out how much that DA knows. And I might err on the side of caution until I know what that DA knows. But that isn't exactly how Judge Daniel McDonald sees things. He sees things in a different light. That the mother, me, I am highly manipulative and lacking credibility, even though I had CPS testify on my behalf, an expert witness of domestic violence who's internationally recognized. I had law enforcement ready to go. I had a mentor. They had one person, Christine Bassett, their paid therapist. And that's who Judge McDonald chose.
In our last few episodes, we have talked about how common this is. A few states have made strides to make court systems more credibly attuned to violence and abuse dynamics. But in many places, the default posture is for courts to skew heavily toward reunification and joint custody, even when there is substantial evidence to believe that abuse might occur. Factor in overburdened systems that look for quick resolution, plus existing biases toward women, especially traumatized women who might not present in acceptable ways. And it's a recipe for disaster for far too many children, whether out of ignorance, negligence, or something more sinister. Anybody involved in the proceedings can be complicit in this, from attorneys to judges to ad litem and investigators. And yes, therapists. For Rachel, this started with her case's magistrate, who ordered reunification therapy with a court-selected therapist.
She ordered reunification therapy despite putting on record that abuse was stipulated. That's what she said. Abuse has been stipulated. We know that. The fathers agree. Okay. She still orders reunification therapy, and that was in March of 2022. From the inception, I knew it was not a good idea. I knew that my kids did not need to be reintroduced to him. I knew it would be damaging. They were already, no, I don't want to do that. We don't have to go, do we? And it was a nightmare from the very beginning. An assessment was supposed to be done because I didn't think that it was necessary or appropriate. And I asked for an assessment before we started therapy, and all agreed. They said, fine, we'll do an assessment. But they chose Christine Bassett, not me. Never once did that assessment get done. But during the assessment that she talks about in emails back and forth to me and my counsel at the time that she's doing the evaluation, the assessment, she was also employing therapeutic methods that were actually disrupting my children and causing them re-traumatization. She was supposed to be doing an assessment for therapy appropriateness. But instead, she just wanted to start the therapy, wanted to start reunifying. So she forces a letter to be read to my children that their father wrote. They both told her no, they didn't want to hear it. And there was a current protection order that forbid third-party contact. She did it anyways. One of my sons got up and ran from the room with his ears covered.
Rachel has a term she likes to use for mental health professionals like this: terrorist. Professionals who use their authority and the tools of their profession to terrorize people with less power than them.
And they exploit you and traffic you and send you out the door more harmed. And then you get to pay to come back and endure it again. And that is exactly what happened with my boys. She did things with my boys. My son asked one time, Miss Chris, if this is supposed to be Christian, I don't think Jesus would make me have a relationship with somebody I didn't want to have a relationship with. Why are you? Jesus wouldn't force me to have a relationship with somebody I'm afraid of and someone who's hurt me. And she told my son, Jesus would want you to forgive. Jesus says we need to forgive. And I about lost my marbles for a minute over that. I will not stand for spiritual abuse. I grew up in the church. I have seen plenty of spiritual abuse, and I will not stand for it. And then she would want to pray with my children after these sessions. And I told my children, absolutely not. You have every right, if you're not interested in that, to say no, thank you, be polite, and excuse yourself.
Christine Bassett advertises as a state-licensed Christian therapist, functioning as part of the official state judicial system. But it's clear that she wielded her faith as a central part of her therapy work, in ways that are downright manipulative. Rachel was never allowed into the sessions, and she certainly wasn't getting the same updates and communication that her ex was receiving. When she asked questions or tried to speak for her kids, she was told that she was meddling or trying to brainwash her boys, and her behavior wouldn't reflect well on her case. Her sons weren't given a choice either. They had to do these relationship-building exercises that were meant to restore a connection with their dad, no matter how much they didn't want to, and no matter how unsafe they felt. When one of her sons refused to participate, the therapist made him sit outside for so long that he got sunburned. When Rachel kept asking questions like why they still hadn't gotten the assessment about whether therapy was even a viable option here, or when she tried communicating how hard it was getting her sons there each week, or paying for these sessions herself, the threat held over her head was that if she did not comply, she would be found in contempt of court and would have to serve jail time.
When I finally got found in contempt and she sentenced me, she suspended it and said, every week that you show up with the kids and pay, we'll push your sentence out another week. Okay, well, it was for 7 weekends of jail. So if I showed up the next week, I wouldn't go to jail that weekend. If I showed up the following week, I wouldn't go to jail. And I had to keep going. When I had that imposed on me, I did end up using funds from a nonprofit that I had started back in 2023 with a program for women going through things like this that paid for the kids to show up to therapy so that mom stayed out of jail. It was the day before our hearing that we showed up to a therapy session, and there was still a restraining order in place between myself and my ex. And they didn't account for that. They didn't make proper arrangements. They tried to coerce me to leave, which was never in my history of leaving. I might have run an errand once, but I would always stay on site. So when I got there and he actually showed up, I called the police because it was a violation of a protection order, regardless that they were there to do therapy. They're the ones that didn't file with the courts to have exceptions and to have things in place. That's not my job. I'm the victim in the protection order. So I reported it. Well, when the police showed up, of course, they interrupted the visit and they pulled him aside. But my boys stayed with the therapist for a bit. And when the police came back to me, they said, you can go check on your children now. I immediately got out of my car where I had been the entire time and went with an eyewitness with me. And I asked Chris Bassett where my son was, and I couldn't see him. And she was standing in a doorway like this, saying, this isn't your time. You don't need to be here. You're interfering with the parenting time. You're interfering. And I said, I need to check on my children. Where are they? And she said, he's over here. And even though she was in the doorway with my body, I just kind of moved in and tried to look around the corner. There was my son in the fetal position. And as soon as he saw my head pop through the doorway, he jumped up and came out to me. And I tried to talk with them and she wouldn't let me. She kept following us around in this grassy area. And I kept saying, just give me 2 minutes with my children. I just need to check if they're okay. And she wouldn't do it and kept talking the whole entire time. You're interrupting. This is inappropriate. The court's going to have to know about this. Just going on and on.
In the chaos of that moment, Rachel pulled her boys as close as she could, and she whispered to them, making sure they felt safe. She could tell they were shocked, but they said they felt okay and could finish the session. The whole thing took 2 minutes, but for this particular therapist, those 2 minutes were all she needed to punish Rachel.
And so that afternoon, it was the day before our court hearing, they filed contempt again that my sentence should be imposed. And so the next day when I showed up in court, Christine Bassett sounded to me, and from my perspective, she was almost gloating that she'd been in the same courtroom 2 days before testifying. That to me was really interesting because originally I was supposed to have that final visit for the boys with her 2 days before court, not the day before court. And she didn't tell me about rescheduling until just 48 or 72 hours before that. So it was like I was set up so that I could do something wrong and they can go to court saying, look what she did, final day before the court orders. And here, look what she did. Because when they went in there that day, they changed from asking for parenting time to asking for sole custody. And she got on the stand and said that she would donate an hour of her time to help the boys transition with Mike into a new safe place. My children also disclosed abuses to her that she flat out ignored. Never once has she gone to court and told the judge what my boys have told her.
Some of our regular listeners might wonder why a series on family court is even relevant to a therapy podcast. But in this case, I'd hope it's pretty obvious. This practitioner, who had ostensibly received at least some sort of training, and who'd been entrusted with the safety and well-being of these boys, was now recommending not just joint custody, but that they be sent to live full-time with their abusive father. Rachel did file a complaint against Christine Bassett with the state licensing agency. It's not clear if anything will come from that, but in the meantime, Rachel was fully at her mercy, and Christine knew it.
She has always tried to intimidate me, coerce me, control, bully, label, whatever she can do, be superior, whatever she can do. She's always been like that. She didn't see any concerns with the boys going to Mike 100%.
Accused of obstructing the reunification process and painted as a mother who had turned her sons against their father, Rachel was charged with contempt of court, a label that would ultimately land her behind bars.
My sentence was 7 weekends, 2 months, right? Chris Bassett said in my hearing, she was in the same courtroom 2 days before testifying. Well, the only thing she testifies to is this stuff, this whole family reunification exploitation. That's what she does. While I was in jail, I got to talking to some of the inmates there who have been there on a more permanent basis and regular basis. And they tell me that 2 months before I served my first weekend there with them, there was another mom that served for the same reason in the same county.
Rachel is far from the only parent who has been jailed for protesting reunification. But when people hear about something like this, it can still feel shocking. A mom locked up for trying to protect her kids? It's hard to believe. So word started to spread quickly, and Rachel's plight sparked a lot of attention.
It was Chris Osher that first broke the story, and he's from the Denver Gazette. He did a story on Aaron Siegel, who helped me tremendously in all of this. I found Aaron through a network of moms going through the same thing. And Aaron was the one that shared my story with Chris Osher and said, you have got to hear this. You've got to know what's going on. This is insane. This mom needs help. And people need to know about this. And you've already been in this realm because Erin has endured and is still enduring her own nightmare. When Chris Osher broke my story, that is when it just went viral everywhere. We had One Mom's Battle pick it up, Moms Fight Back, National Safe Parents Organization, we had 9 News. It went crazy, but it was really Erin Siegel from Fortitude and Flourish, who does divorce coaching and parenting coaching, who saw what was going on with me and said, no, we need to get this to the media. And she really was instrumental in helping to advocate. And when she brought Chris Osher to me, I said, yes, I want to talk to him, because I had read his articles and knew, okay, he gets it. He understands it. He'll put it out there the right way.
At one of the hearings, the judge said the public attention was unlike anything he had ever seen. He called it a mob mentality and claimed that he'd gotten death threats. And he even tried to shift the blame for Rachel's jail sentence as if his hands had been tied, saying it wouldn't have happened if she had had an attorney.
He talked about how this wouldn't have happened if Miss Pickrel Hawkins wouldn't have been pro se. Well, that's interesting because he gave some big long spiel that are in the transcripts of the divorce, the final hearing for a divorce decree, that he gives all pro se litigants a fair hearing and even tries to go out of his way to help them. And then he flips and says, this probably happened because she didn't have representation.
As word spreads and Rachel keeps telling her story, she's learning more and more about just how many moms there are in similar circumstances.
And I think that's how it just keeps perpetuating. And then you get these poor moms in these court systems, and a lot of them are gagged. And that's another thing that's going on right now. You have women that are gagged and then they're sent to jail and they can't talk about it. They lose parental rights to their children while they're in jail and gagged. This has happened here in Colorado. I was just on a call with this woman. There were so many other women that were commenting, I've been gagged, I've been gagged, I've been jailed and gagged. And so they keep it all quiet. And so people need to understand this is not just some crazy story that happens once in a while. Unfortunately, my situation is not unique. There are many women and children out there that are going through situations horrendous, and even more so than mine.
Finally, last July, the official criminal charges against Mike were announced. He's facing 7 felony counts of child sexual abuse, including alleged rape of his elementary-aged daughter in 2012, plus a misdemeanor count of physical child abuse. Rachel knew this would make it harder to dismiss her story, and it meant she could finally force an end to the dangerous reunification therapy. Of course, in family therapy, 1 + 1 does not necessarily equal 2. Things are always at least a little more complicated than they should be.
Anyways, it was right around there. They had a visit. And that's when I told Christine Bassett, you need to understand, he has felony sex assault of child, person in position of trust, charges being filed against him. And she took my boys into the room with him and said, we need to make progress. You boys need to forgive your dad.
Even after Mike was arraigned and slapped with an ankle monitor, another judge stepped into the case and lifted the protective order. He said Rachel's sons needed to be dragged back into court so further reunification therapy could be considered. And this is the tragic reality of family court systems all over the country. Through a combination of feet dragging, lazy assumptions, a lack of education about abuse, and sometimes a wink, wink, look the other way sort of complicity, it can be next to impossible for protective parents to gain the support they need. But thanks to all of the attention her case has attracted, Rachel knew she was far from alone in this fight, and she was finally able to retain legal representation.
And we went in on September 12th with an emergency motion that I had filed pro se. And then I retained counsel and we went in on that emergency motion saying, hey, look, there's criminal charges now. This is for real. And this needs to stop. And there needs to be no more reunification. And mom doesn't need to go to jail. And that's when finally, September 12th, Judge McDonald had to walk everything back and say, okay, well, you've served enough jail time and the kids are going to stop reunification therapy and there's going to be a protection order in place and you have 100% of everything. I have 100% physical sole custody of the kids, 100% parenting decision-making, no reunification therapy. The protection order is back in place and nothing is to be changed until the criminal matters are settled. This coming month on the 31st, he has a preliminary hearing. And my understanding is this is where evidence is given to a judge to show probable cause for the charges. And my understanding is that from here, there could be another date set for an arraignment, where at that time, I understand part of the process is there could be a plea offered at that time, or he could decide to go to trial. Once we get through those hearings, if he doesn't want to plead to anything, then a trial would be set. And it kind of sounds like the time frame could be possibly spring of 25.
It means the world to Rachel that her sons are with her, that all her children are safe and no longer being re-traumatized. But they're still very much dealing with the fallout of everything that has happened. Trying to find permanent housing and some sense of normalcy has been a challenge, but they're starting to move forward and searching for healing. Meanwhile, Rachel plans to keep telling her story, doing as much as she can to educate people about the family court failures and about all the different, sometimes subtle ways in which domestic abuse can occur. She says we all need to fight for more protections for our children. We need to make sure that judges, counselors, government agencies, CPS, and everyone involved in these cases needs to be educated about the insidious dynamics of abuse. And they need to be held accountable when they don't do anything to prevent further harm. You can find Rachel on TikTok and follow the nonprofit she started. And you can also email her at justiceforchildrennow. That's justice, 4, childrenrightnow@gmail.com. She also started a nonprofit, Mount Simon Ministries, to address these issues. And she's developing ways to support families in similar situations through legal help, therapy, housing, and other resources. And you can learn more, including where things stand in your own state and how you might be able to help through groups like National Safe Parents Organization, One Mom's Battle, or Moms Fight Back. A big thank you to this week's guest, Rachel Pickrel Hawkins, for sharing her story. We'd also like to extend our gratitude to our talented writer, Bo Denton, and the audio engineers at Peachtree Sound. Thank you for listening this week, and I hope you'll join us next time as we wrap up our series on family court.